Hello, friends. Good evening. Welcome. I'm saying good evening because I'm recording it at this evening. Welcome to the third week in our video study series on kingdom stories. This week we'll be covering the parables of the mustard seed, the yeast, and the narrow door. And I'm so excited about this week because I think we do have some actual kind of a deep study things that I couldn't possibly have fit into the sermon. And so I'm excited to share those with you. I want to talk to you about why we should study the parables. I know I keep repeating that question, but I'm going to repeat it and answer it because there's some new things for us to share about it. The parables are some of the most challenging things to really contextualize and interpret in all of the New Testament. Many other places in the New Testament, Jesus shows up, he teaches something that's pretty straightforward, he heals some people, and the interpretation is pretty simple. But parables are different because they're a story within a story, and oftentimes there are all sorts of social cues that we would miss unless someone interpreted them for us. So the purpose of a parable is really threefold. First of all, this is supposed to hold up a mirror to us so that we look in the mirror and see both ourselves, but also what we should look like as members or citizens of the kingdom of God. That's really important. Second, this is supposed to help us. Parables are supposed to help us confront the reality of what the kingdom is like. And third, they're inviting people to participate in the kingdom and live according to it. That's what I've talked about when I said that sometimes Jesus is inviting us to either find ourselves in the story, to plot our place in the story where we fit in this allegory or whatever it is, or to get involved in the story. How do we study the parables? This is one of the things that makes it so challenging. There's at least 4 different types of parables that are in the gospel. First, there is a type of parable called a similitude. It's basically a simile. Jesus says the kingdom of God is like. And today, with the story of the mustard seed and the yeast, those are classic similitude parables. Second, there's a type of parable called an example story. The parable of the Good Samaritan is a perfect example of an example story. And many times they finish with Jesus saying, "Go and do likewise." That's a good clue that you're in that kind of a parable. A third type is a parable proper. It's an extended metaphor surrounding a fictional event. The parable of the great banquet, which we're going to look at next week on our sermon for March 14th, that's a great example of the classic parable proper. And then there is an allegory, a series of related metaphors built around a fictional event. And the parable of the sower, which we looked at our very first week, is the perfect example of an allegorical parable. Now, how do we study and make sense of these parables? There's several things we need to do and look at. First of all, we have to analyze the text of the story, and if it shows up in a different gospel, whether that's Matthew or Mark or Luke, we need to look at the parallels that are there and see if it's told slightly different in each gospel, or if the wording is just makes sense for us. Then we need to pay attention to any cultural or historical features. I'll call them artifacts. A really good example is some of the farming things that we talked about in the parable of the sower. Those are artifacts that don't fit our farming culture today, so they need to be interpreted. We also need to listen to the parables as they're told in the context of Jesus' ministry. How do they fit in the narrative of Jesus' story? What does their place in the narrative tell us about what Jesus was trying to accomplish theologically? Also, we need to look for help in the story itself, in that kingdom story, to figure out, is there anything that we need to understand? Is there anything about the context that makes sense that needs to be translated? We also need to ask, how does this parable fit into the plan and the purpose of the Gospel of Luke or the Gospel of Matthew? We're going to talk about that a little bit later tonight in this video. We need to ask how the function of the entire story fits into the whole body of Jesus' teachings, if we can. And then we need to determine the theological thrust or significance of the story. And finally, With a parable, we always pay attention to the ending of the story because that's usually where we understand what it means. I'm going to read the smallest part of the text for this week. It's from Luke chapter 13, verses 18 through 21. Then Jesus asked, "What is the kingdom of God like? What do I compare it to? It is like a mustard seed which a man took and planted in his garden. It grew and became a tree, and the birds perched in its branches." And again he asked, "What shall I compare the kingdom of God to? It is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into about 60 pounds of flour until it worked all through the dough." So we need to ask, what do we need to know about the parable of the mustard seed and the yeast from other gospels? Well, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have versions of these parables in their record of Jesus' teachings. But the parable of the narrow door is unique to Luke's gospel. It only occurs there. And Luke packaged these three parables together as a unit to tell his audience some things. Just like I said earlier, we need to figure out, what does the purpose of Luke as an author, how does this fit his theology of what he's trying to say to the audience? First of all, Luke was saying that the kingdom of God is a powerful, unstoppable, unshakable force. This would have been very important to Luke's audience because many of them were Greek speakers who were Gentiles who did not necessarily grow up in a Jewish household. And they are people who are joining a new minority religion that other people in a Greek-speaking world would have considered a cult. So, it's really important for them to hear that God's kingdom is expanding and is gonna happen. It's inevitable, it's powerful, it's unshakable. Also, because of who they were needing to know that they were included in God's plan. So when Jesus talks about people being invited from the north, the south, the east, and the west in the parable of the narrow door, that's a signal to them that they belong. They have a place. They fit. And then lastly, they are trying to identify the God of Israel and the kingdom through ethnic or cultural identity alone. And Jesus is saying that's not sufficient for salvation. That would have been important for Luke's audiences to hear because some of them would probably have been involved in churches with people who grew up in a Jewish household and people who did not. And it would have been vitally important for them to know that they fit and they belong and that their ethnic identity alone doesn't disqualify them. We need to ask this question: what do we need to know about the narrative setting of this teaching of the mustard seed and the yeast and the narrow door? The first incident of this parable takes place right after Jesus' confrontation with the Pharisees. He healed a woman on the Sabbath, he's confronted about it in public, and he says, listen, any of you would treat an animal with respect and dignity if it fell into a ditch on the Sabbath. How much more should you be caring for this human woman who has a need to be healed? And right after that, Jesus goes into a teaching about the kingdom. He talks about the mustard seed. He talks about the yeast. And then we get a little side comment that tells us that Jesus then set out on a new teaching tour and worked his way to Jerusalem. And while Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem, he begins teaching, including these parables of the mustard seed and the yeast, but then also adds the parable of the narrow door. And he was doing this as he was preparing to leave for Jerusalem and as he traveled. That's the narrative setting of this story. In fact, most experts who study Luke think that Jesus is referring to his very last trip right before the triumphal entry when he's on his way to Jerusalem. Now, we need to think about what type of parable these are. I said it earlier, but I'll say it again. The parable of the mustard seed and the yeast are similitudes, and they are a call to action. They're intended to tell us that God's doing something big and powerful, and we should be excited and want to get involved. The parable of the narrow door is really an example story. It's much like the story of the Good Samaritan. So when Jesus says to all of the listeners of this parable, make every effort to enter through the narrow door, That's his way of saying, go and do likewise. Be the people who make every effort to get into the house where the Son of Man lives. And this parable is definitely a call to action. It's a call for people to respond to the kingdom that Jesus is launching and that will happen in the future. We need to think about the parables and who the players are in the parables. In the first two, it's pretty simple. The mustard seed and the yeast, they're simple metaphors for growth of the members of the kingdom and the impact of the kingdom. What Jesus is saying is that the people are going to experience amazing, powerful, transformative growth in their lives. Like yeast, Jesus is going to take over their lives. But also, because of that, the impact of everything they do is going to be powerful and significant. Those are the players in those two parables. But in the parable of the narrow door, there's much more going on narratively. The keeper of the narrow door is Jesus himself. The guests are the people of Israel, the ones who knock and want to get in, and Jesus says, friend, I tell you, I don't know you. That's directed towards the nation of Israel. And again, the people who come from the north, the south, the east, and the west, those are Gentiles, non-Jewish people that soon become members of the kingdom of God. Now, there's something that I need to pause and talk about here, and it's quirky. It's something I didn't have time to talk about in the sermon, and I wouldn't because it could be controversial and a little bit weird. There are various people, various Christians out there in the world who interpret the parable of the mustard seed and the yeast especially in a very unusual way. These are people who I believe misinterpret these parables in an allegorical manner. Just like I talked about last week in the sermon, they almost assign, hey, I think that person that Jesus is teaching about is Benedict Arnold. That's what these folks are doing. They interpret the birds in the parable of the mustard seed as Satan and or his demons. And so they're saying that, yes, the tree grows really big and the birds come and perch or nest there, but they eat up all the seeds and that's bad. There's no evidence from the text that that's what Jesus was telling, by the way. They also interpret the yeast as an illustration of the spread of evil throughout the church, and they do this by combining another thing that Jesus said about yeast. In another place in the Gospels, Jesus said, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees, of how it spreads. The people who espouse this interpretation are called premillennialists. They're people who are committed to a specific interpretation of Revelation chapter 20, verses 1 through 6. They believe in a pre-tribulation rapture of the church that happens before the 1,000-year reign of Jesus. That's why they're called premillennialists. They believe in a literal interpretation that Jesus is going to reign for a literal 1,000-year period, and they believe that they're living in between, you and I are living in between, the second of three appearances of Jesus. He appeared first in the first century. He appears second at the rapture of the church. He calls the church home. And then he appears for the third time to reign forever, setting up this 1,000-year kingdom where Satan is bound and Jesus ministers to humanity. They also believe in a gospel of pessimism. For people who espouse this, they believe that the world is almost totally evil. Here's a really good example of premillennialism. The Left Behind series, which was so popular a few years ago, that was written by somebody who is a committed premillennialist. They interpret Revelation 20, verses 1 through 6 in a certain way. That's not who we are as Methodists. As Methodists, we are not premillennialists. We are amillennialists. We believe that there is a 1,000-year reign of Jesus, but we believe that that is a metaphorical reign. It may not be an actual 1,365-day period of time. We also believe that Jesus is reigning in heaven right now, and we could be experiencing that, although it doesn't feel like a perfect world. And we believe that Jesus will return when all things are put under his footstool, like the book of Hebrews talks about, and when all of the good news of the kingdom of God has been spread throughout the entire world, which many people believe hasn't fully happened yet, believe it or not, even in the 21st century. Here's the thing. I believe that our job is to interpret the Bible through the lens of Jesus, not to interpret the words of Jesus through the lens of the writer, the Apostle Paul or the Apostle John. And so that's why I am a committed amillennialist at this point in my life. I don't believe that I should be using Revelation 20 to interpret the rest of Jesus' teachings. I believe that Jesus' teachings interprets the rest of the Bible for me. Why do we study the kingdom of God on this quirky basis? Well, we do it because it helps us understand the nature of what Jesus meant when he talked about salvation. That's why so many people have different and divergent issues around this. They're trying to figure out what salvation means for us as humans. Also, we study the kingdom of God because it helps us understand the future that awaits us as kingdom citizens. That's why even though these are tiny parables, the parable of the mustard seed and the yeast, there is big debate over what they mean in the context of all of God's kingdom. And then the last things I want to do is answer this question. What's important about the explanation of the parable for Jesus' disciples, for then and for you and I for today? Jesus is telling his audience that the kingdom is unstoppable and inevitable. But Jesus was also telling his audience that citizenship or membership in the kingdom was not a birthright for Jews or any particular group of people. And if citizenship or membership in the kingdom is not assured for first century Jews, then it's not assured for you and I either, unless our conduct and our belief puts us there. We can't count on birthright or identity as cultural Christians or religious consumers to be the pathway that takes us to the kingdom of God. This week, I tried to fill out some vaccination forms, and I had to disclose my ethnic identity, and I had to check a box. There are people in our world today who look at Christianity that way. Yep, I checked that box. I'm a Christian. I go to church a few times. I serve a little. I give a little. I show up a little. That's what I mean by religious consumerism or cultural Christianity. There's no guarantee that those kinds of folks are going to enter the kingdom of God. Jesus says, make every effort. In other words, you have to know Jesus. You have to know him intimately, to follow his teachings explicitly, to live according to his example, and to allow yourself to be transformed and conformed to the image of Jesus Christ. That is what is a prerequisite for membership in the kingdom of God. I don't really feel like I have time this week to read all of the study questions, but Arden came up with some fantastic study questions that are included in the PDF that's on our website. I want to encourage you to look there. And also want to just say in a closing word, if any of you have any additional questions or a need for dialogue, or you want to learn more, or maybe you want to take a peek at the notes that I put together for the talk that I just did, please reach out and email me, send me a message through Facebook Messenger or something. I would be so excited to talk to you more about this, because I can't think of anything more important than understanding what it means to be a citizen of the kingdom of God now, as well as it did in Jesus' time. Have a blessed evening.